and thank you for joining us on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, and we'll have fun exploring the history of the city of Mississauga together. Are there things that you're curious about? How things were named, perhaps an old road name or an old building or a cemetery, or stories from our past that you've always wondered about? Please do send in your questions. This week we're doing something a little different. Following up on a part of our series from a few weeks ago, we're going to be exploring some shipwrecks associated with the mariners of historic Port Credit. In a past episode of Ask a Historian, we explored the wreck of the Augusta, which happened in 1902. Following that, we received an inquiry about other shipwrecks and what other stories might have been told about the maritime history of Port Credit and throughout historic Mississauga. As a maritime community, residents of Port Credit have been tied to the life of the life on the waters of Lake Ontario for generations. And sadly, those same waters have claimed many lives and vessels over time. Many vessels were built in the shipyards of Port Credit. We don't think of Port Credit necessarily in those terms today, but yes, indeed, there were shipyards in Port Credit that fashioned many a vessel that would go to ply the waters of Lake Ontario. Port Credit wasn't the only place that built boats, of course, and many of the boats that sailed out of the Port Credit were built elsewhere, Oakville and Bronte and over in Toronto and beyond. And ships tended to be a little transient in times of depending on where their home port was called, where a new owner might take the ship. But many boats that would perhaps be stationed in Port Credit would also call on port at say Oakville Harbor or Bronte Harbor or beyond. And so you had a little bit of a transientness to the way ships interacted with their ports of call. But they were all well known, historically speaking, and many of them were known as what are stone hookers, those ships engaged in the harvesting of shale and the transporting of shale from the lake bottom to building markets in Toronto and elsewhere. Again, many of the vessels that were built indeed in Port Credit and sailed out of this port for a period of time. They included just a smattering of names because there were dozens of them. The Anne Brown, the Ariadne, the Arthur Hannah, the Catherine Hayes, the Defiance, the George Dow, the Hunter, the Liliphone, the Lillian, the Lone Star, the Mabel, the Madeline, the Mary Ann, the Mary E. Ferguson, the Maud S., the Olympia, the Rapid City, and the Reindeer, just to name a few. Other vessels that sailed out of Port Credit and were lost on Lake Ontario include the Annabelle Chambers, the Augusta, which we spoke about a few weeks ago, the Bark Swallow, the Coronet, the Jessie Drummond, the Morning Star, the Pinta, the Samson, and the White Wings, amongst others. There are many stories of stone hookers and sailing vessels lost in storms on Lake Ontario and sailors who have never returned home in the resting place somewhere in the deep cold waters of Lake Ontario. Schooner Days by C.H.J. Schneider, along with several other articles and books and excerpts from late Port Credit historian Lauren Joyce, recall the heyday of the stone hooking trade, but also those ships and sailors that were lost. And just a couple of them. This is Tales from the Great Lake, excerpts from the columns Schooner Days by C.H.J. Schneider. Tales of the Great Lakes was put together by Robert Townsend. A great maritime tale, if you will, centered really focusing, say, from Toronto to Oakville for the most part, including Port Credit. Just a wonderful tale of early sailing stories, if you will. And also, At the Mouth of the Credit River by Betty Clarkson includes a small chapter by late historian Lauren Joyce on the stone hookers and some of the stories of those ships lost to the lake. Many records are challenging to find. There's scatterings of newspaper clippings about some of the wrecks, vague references to others. Again, C.H.J. Schneider did a wonderful job recalling some of those stories of wrecks as well. But the names of some vessels are names only. We can find no other information about their loss and the fate of their crew. And so it's kind of like a piecemeal story that we have of the ships that plied the waters and never returned home. The earliest associated shipwreck to Port Credit was that of the Maid of the West. She was a three-masted schooner that set sail in 1849. She sprang a leak at Grand Traverse Bay on Lake Michigan while carrying a load of lumber during a storm on September 2nd of 1856 and sank. The ship, thankfully, the crew of the ship, thankfully escaped in a yawl and were rescued. Honestly, it's an early wreck, again taking place September 2nd of 1856 on Lake Michigan. The Maid of the West sailed out of Port Credit. That was her home port. She was a cargo vessel. And other than that, we know very little about her. There's no newspaper columns given how early it was. There's very little known about the Maid of the West. But 1856, that is the first reference we have to a shipwreck associated with the port at Port Credit. Another early ship that met with mishap was the Minnie Blakely. Minnie Blakely, we know a little bit more about. She was built in 1873 by Alex Blakely and is named for his wife, and she sailed out of Port Credit. On September 2nd, 1881, and it's the same date as the accident associated with the Maid of the West, just many years later. But on September 2nd, 1881, she was carrying she was fully loaded with ashes bound from Trenton for Oswego, and in a dense fog, lost her way, and she went hard aground on a sandbar off of Point Anne in the Bay of Quinte near Belleville. The crew was able to evacuate the ship, and by September 2nd, by September 16th, about 2 weeks later, the Minnie Blakely, still hard aground, had been shifted by the lake, swamped, and sunk, with only a part of her bow showing above the waterline. 2 years later, she was refloated, salvaged, and rebuilt, and sailed again under a different name. But the shoal she struck and foundered on was named the Minnie Blakely Shoal, just in the Bay of Quinte, just off of Belleville today. On some maritime maps, you'll still see the marker for the Minnie Blakely Shoal. And she was a schooner sailing out of Port Credit until her fateful mishap on September 2nd in 1881. The next ship in our story for this week was the schooner Jessie Drummond, and we know a little bit more about Jessie Drummond than the first two ships. And the Drummond, as she was known, had a long career before slipping below the waters of the lake. The Drummond was built in 1865 in St. Catharines, and she was a freighter and then later converted into a stonehooker. And she called Port Hope, Port Credit, and Oakville her home ports over time. Again, as she was sold and with different owners, she would call at different ports throughout her timeline. The Drummond had her share of early trials. Early in her life, she was sent to cross the Atlantic Ocean to Hamburg, Germany, returning with a load of iron rails. In 1878, she survived an attempted mutiny by a sailor from Toronto who attempted to kill the first mate, Robert Colts, and threatened the captain, Captain Maw. In 1894, the Drummond, racing against a late fall storm on October 28th of 1894, cleared the Western Gap with only inches to spare, entering the safety of Toronto Harbour. Captain Quinn of Oakville recalled the harrowing moments as he fought to keep the ship on course, unable to do anything firm as rode the winds and waves at breakneck speed, expecting to be dashed apart in the fury of the storm. She made it into harbour that day, leaking albeit, but still made it into harbour. The Drummond also survived the November 24th, 1900 storm that claimed the Augusta, and we spoke about the Augusta in an earlier edition of Ask a Historian. With her crew en route from Toronto to Oakville and anchored a mile and a half out of Port Credit, trying to ride out the gale. Damaged, leaking badly, and flying a distress flag, the Drummond made it through the night and limped into Port Credit Harbour with the assistance from a tug the next day. In May of 1902, the Drummond, now a worthy veteran of the lakes, almost 40 years in service, the Drummond sprang a leak while sailing between Hamilton and Oswego. She never made it to Hamilton, and had to attempt to make the harbor at Toronto in an emergency. Her pumps were running continuously to keep her afloat. She made it, and she was repaired and entered service, but her luck had run out. On December 2nd, 1902, while traveling from Oswego to Coburg with a load of 600 tons of soft coal, she raced against a strong headwind and tried to reach Coburg before the full fury of the nor'wester, the storm, bore down on her. She missed the mark. The Drummond missed the harbor lights, overshot the harbor entrance at Coburg, and grounded hard, exposed to the full sweep of the lake and the fury of the wind. Her sails were tattered, her hull was cracked and broken on the shoal, and she was swamped from the stern, and slowly pulled under into the lake. At the time, she was owned by Herb Milne of Oakville, and all 7 of her crew were able to get off with the assistance of the life-saving crew at Coburg. The Drummond was torn apart by the lake, pulled into the depths. The wreck of the Drummond was not found until 1999, and the anchor of the Jessie Drummond was recovered and is now on display at the Coburg Marina. Our final story for this week is on a ship known as the Pinta, and while she did not call Port Credit her home port, she was well known in Port Credit and beyond. Her principal port was that of Oakville, but she stopped frequently at Port Credit, making a common run from from Oakville to Toronto. She was a stone hooker by trade. That is, she was principally geared towards the hauling of stone, the transport of stone, from the shale beds around Port Credit and Oakville into the building markets of Toronto. But the Pinta was a little bit more like a scow than a ship. She was shallow, she was wide, really ideal for lifting of stone onto the main deck of a ship, low to the waterline. She was 58 feet long, 14 feet wide, but with gunwales, when empty, that rose barely a foot off the waterline. She was not designed for rough water, especially when overloaded. On November 20th of 1879, the Pinta was heading to Toronto from Oakville into the face of a fast-approaching nor'wester. The captain, upon departing, thought they had enough time to make the brief crossing into Toronto. As one early sailor recalled, the storm came hoofing along, surprising everyone by its speed. The captain of the Pinta, the Pinty as she was known, was a well-seasoned mariner from Oakville, of the Quinn family, William Quinn. The Quinn family, numerous mariners out of the Quinn family, but Captain William Quinn soon found himself in a desperate struggle. The Pinty was fully loaded, some reports say overloaded, with 65 tons of stone, and her gunwales were barely 6 inches above the waterline. In calm seas, the Pinty could have made it. That day, the seas were anything but calm, and it came on fast. As the Pinty came near the Clarkson area, it is believed that Captain Quid made a judgment call based on the seas that he was facing, and determining that he could not safely make the Port Credit harbor, let alone Toronto, he turned the Pinty, either in hopes of finding shelter in the lee at Marigold's Point, at Clarkson, or returning to the safety of Oakville Harbor. He was blinded by a fierce and sudden snow squall, blasted with freezing temperatures, pounded by waves and slashing winds that tore the sails apart, and the Pinty never made it. Men on shore at Marigold's Point and Clarkson saw the Pinty being pounded, and they called for help. But help was too far away and too late, and some newspapers of the day suggested that the help itself was very poorly managed. All hands aboard the Pinta were lost that day. A week later, the battered hull of the Pinta washed ashore on the other side of the lake east of Hamilton. The frozen body of one of the sailors was found among the wreckage. Lost at sea were Captain William Quinn of Oakville, mate Joseph Quinn of Oakville, and crewmen Sampson Joseph Howell of Bronte and Alex Mason of Port Credit. There was a poem written on the sinking of the Pinty in 1879. There are actually numerous things written about the sinking of the Pinta, and particularly in the Oakville area, where her loss was felt with incredible sadness. Families left behind of those sailors that were lost at sea. Sad was the news that came to our town of Pinta being lost in a gale she went down. When off Marigold's Point, the sea running high, she sprang a bag leak, though the shore was nigh. The gallant young crew tried to keep her afloat. She was sinking so fast they took to the boat. The wind off the shore blew heavy and strong, not an oar nor a sail to help them along. They were seen from the shore, but no one dared try, no hope at hand, the seas running high. There were strong willing hearts that were ready to save and rescue crew from a watery grave. Alas, 'twas no use, they drifted away and were never seen alive from that very day. That poem was written by L.R. Sweet in Oakville in 1879. And there are other references also to the sinking of the Pinty, again, November 20th of 1879, and the face of a strong nor'wester. So a sad tale for a ship and crew lost just off of Mississauga in the Clarkson area back in 1979. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask a Historian. And next week's episode, we will continue the look at some historic shipwrecks associated with Port Credit and historic Mississauga. And we look forward to exploring those tales with you. In the meantime, if you're looking for more, again, I highly do recommend Tales from the Great Lake by the excerpts of the articles by C.H.J. Schneider, writing then for the Toronto Telegram. That's thanks to Robert Townsend, who put the book together. A very good collection of early mariner tales on this side of Lake Ontario. Also, for this episode, a true thank you to local historian Richard Collins and to late Port Credit historian Lauren Joyce for their tales and memories associated with the ships and the shipwrecks of Port Credit. So again, join us next week for another episode of Ask a Historian, and we look forward to exploring the fascinating history of the city of Mississauga with you. Thank you.